Okay, AP US History, Chapter 1 of American Pageant. This is new for the class. In an attempt to get everybody familiarized with Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, which we do not go over in class, I created these two videos for 1 and Chapter 2 to help you out a little bit as we venture into the class. You will be responsible for Chapter 1 and 2, even though we don't cover it. It will be on the first test, which will encompass chapters 1 through 4. So you could, go over and listen to this, obviously, but more importantly, I won't say more importantly, but just as important would be for you to read all of Chapter 1 and all of Chapter 2, which is a must in this class. You don't want to get behind. So that being said, I'm doing this to help you out. It's going to be rough around the edges because it's the first time I've done it, but I'll do my best to impart all my knowledge on you as I will the entire year. So let's get going. Chapter 1. Chapter 1 in American Pageant is lays the groundwork for obviously the rest of the book. It's the New World Beginnings. That's the title of Chapter 1. So normally I don't put too much emphasis on 1 and 2, but recently, I think it was 2 years ago, there was a document-based question on the AP exam that had dealt with the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas, and we just briefly went over that. So I felt pretty bad about it. So I'm making sure that we cover all bases. So first off, I want to start by telling you that goes way, 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 way back in history when 250 million years ago, there was a gigantic continent known as Pangea. All continents were connected. We have a lot of proof of that, but the most obvious proof is the puzzle that exists. That if you look at say South America and Africa, you can easily see where the two fit together, and doesn't take much to figure that out. But also we have similar species in lakes and rivers, fauna. Plant and animal life, very similar on to the Western Hemisphere and the East and the Eastern Hemisphere. So that gives you a lot of proof that at one point all the continents were together. Now, what happened to them is they started drifting apart. It's called continental drift. It's something they'll probably cover more in a science class, but the continents are moving inches per year away from each other. The bottom here, the map shows you, if you're patient, you'll see that the continents will move away from each other. That happened over millions of years. So it's very, very small movements, but the continents are drifting away from each other. So that's where we're at this point on the bottom, the present day. That's where the continents exist, and it's pretty easy to wrap your head around the fact that all the continents were together if you look at the bottom. The Ice Age. Let's talk about the importance of the Ice Age in American history. It's how people got on the Western Hemisphere. By Western Hemisphere, I mean North America, Central America, and South America. On the map here, you can see it on the left. At one point, there was nobody in the Americas. Not a soul was in the Americas. It was simply animals and plant life. Life was said to begin somewhere in Africa or Asia. They haven't pinpointed exactly where. And somehow people got over to North America, Central America, South America, the Western Hemisphere. And it wasn't by boat because people were too primitive at the time to construct a boat. So really what it was, what scientists have narrowed it down to is the Ice Age. That at one point the Earth was encompassed by so much ice because we were in a cooling period that the ice came all the way down to, present day Oregon, Washington, maybe even a little bit into California where we live. And the same thing was happening all around the top of the world, or the top of the Earth, and then all along the bottom too. So it was very, very cold. Living in Salinas like we do now, the climate would have been much different. It snowed a lot of the time. Snow probably didn't remain on the ground year round, but there were times when it was very thick. There's said to have been a mile of ice over New York City. That's how far down the ice came. So what that caused was a land bridge to form at the Bering Strait. the closest distance between the two, the eastern hemisphere and the western hemisphere, is the Bering Strait. Deadliest catch is filmed up there today. So obviously we know it's not ice, it's water now because we're in a warming trend. The ice has melted. But when it was cold, that's people drifted across. So technically speaking, the first person to walk across the land bridge was the direct discoverer of America. We call him an indirect discoverer of America today because we give Columbus credit for that, as correct or incorrect as that might be. So the first person in class, I called him the player because he's everybody's daddy. He walked across, probably chasing after food. It was a woolly mammoth maybe that he was chasing after, and he was trying to sustain life. So he walked across without knowing that he discovered a new land, but nonetheless, he came across, and then thousands and thousands and thousands of years later, people spread all the way out in North America, and it got this down in South America and all the way to the tip of South America. And the Earth warmed, the ice melted, and goodbye to the land bridge. The land bridge was gone. What's interesting now is that we could study people who existed in North, Central, and South America, and also people who existed in Africa and Europe and Asia. They didn't know about each other. They existed separately, and we could study both. And then that's where what comes into play is, well, who's the first person to actually travel over? Columbus is given credit for that in 1492 when he mistakenly traveled to the Americas. So we'll get into that as we go. In 1492, when Columbus did do that, the known world in 1492 is in purple. That's what they knew about. They had no idea about the Americas, the Western Hemisphere. They are going to find out, but not by Columbus. Columbus is going to die not knowing that he discovered a new world. Glacial evidence. We know that glaciers did exist. It's the evidence is plain to see. You could see U-shaped valleys here. Those valleys used to be covered in ice. There used to be mountains in those areas, but ice knocked down mountains and left their trace. Lakes, like the Great Lakes, are carved out. The water in the Great Lakes was melted snow and ice. So there is evidence. You could see it. You just have to be aware. This picture is of Yosemite. You could see Half Dome in the background. You look at this picture here, and you could see U-shaped valleys in there that were carved out by the glaciers. And here you could see the retreating of the glaciers. We're in a warming trend right now. This is 1948 on the left, 2002 in the middle, and 2006. And I imagine if you looked at it in 2016, there'd be no snow or ice there at all because we're in that warming trend. And because scientists do think that we're speeding up that warming trend by gases the carbon monoxide gas that we give off from vehicles and the ruining of the ozone, which is heating up the planet, may be contributing to the melting of the ice even faster than it already is. Another kind of cool picture here of a U-shaped valley, which was once snow and ice. The Bering Strait, here's a picture here, or a map that shows you where the first nomadic settlers, hunter-gatherers, were crossing and just were following the food. Hunter-gatherers, that's what hunter-gatherer societies do. I found some cool pictures online of people who live up at the Bering Strait now. They live like that, kind of a little bit of a different existence than we do here in California. Okay, so let's talk about some of the different tribes that existed. So now we're going to back up and we're going to look at what the Western Hemisphere was like after the initial settlers came over. They separated out. You've got Native Americans who live in the North, in North America, in Central America, and in South America. Some were more fortunate than others. Native Americans that lived in, let's say, Arizona in the hot desert had a tougher life. Indians that lived in the, say, Rocky Mountains or in the Dakotas, life was tough. Californian Indians probably had it a little bit easier, just like we have it easier. Now, if overall, though, Native Americans that lived in South and Central America, places like Mexico and Peru, they had it easier because it's temperate weather, long growing seasons, abundance of fish and wildlife, fertile soil. So life was much simpler for them. It always confuses my students because the first thing they think of when I ask them the question of who had it better, Native Americans that lived in present day United States or Native Americans that lived in present day South America or Central America. And of course, we being so self-centered want to say that Native Americans that lived in the present day United States would have had it easier, which is incorrect. The Aztecs, Mayas, and Incas all came from South and Central America. They had advanced societies. They created civilizations. They had cultures, the way that they did things every day, a culture. They were high tech and they were stable societies. They were farmers. They were thinkers. They created calendars and they created an alphabet and they studied the stars and the moon and the sun. All these kind of cool things that they were able to do because they knew where their next meal was coming from. If you're an Indian that lived in North America, you didn't know where your next meal was going to come from. And all they could think about was making sure that they sustained life and followed the food wherever it went. So they weren't stable in North America, but in South and Central America, they were, interestingly enough. The three most advanced tribes, as I said, the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas. The Aztecs lived in present-day Mexico. They were warlike. They built a huge society. They built an empire. They took over territory. They defeat other tribes and take over their land and force the prisoners of war to become slaves or fight for them so they could take over still more territory. They found gold in the rivers in the area and the mountains and the rivers, and to them it was a novelty. It was a cool thing that they used for decoration, but when the Europeans came, they couldn't believe how much gold was there. So the Aztecs were probably the most advanced. You see some of the early Aztec art, and their capital was at Tenochtitlan. It was a floating city. They dug out a huge moat all around it, and they built a capital city here with gold in the walls, and they had drawbridges to protect them from attack. It was an amazing capital. The technology that it took to build it was unbelievable. Unbelievable. Tenochtitlan, their capital. You can see some of their architecture here as well. Let's talk a little bit about the Incas. The Incas lived in the northern part of South America. They had a system of roads. They had an organized society. They too found a lot of gold. They were organized and thrived in this area. Eventually, it's those roads that the Europeans are going to come and they're going to take and they're going to get after their gold, and they're going to take those roads and they're going to attack the Incas. But for a long time, the Incas were strong in that territory. Machu Picchu, the lost city of the Incas, city that they built. The third group we'll talk here about are the Mayas. The Mayans ruins located in Central America. Amazing architecture here. You could see people walking up and down those steps. You can't do that today, as you shouldn't be able to. One, it's dangerous, and two, wearing away at these ruins that were built hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and they're still standing today.